There's nothing all that interesting about this camcorder. It follows the same general design and layout as the Hi8 TRV 108, 308, and 608 models, with some slight deviations in its functionality, buttons, and other design characteristics. In fact, the first difference that we may notice, if you'll forgive the lack of a screen on this Hi8 Handycam, this being the same TRV 608, of which there was a review on my channel several months, if not a year ago, you'll notice that the color does vary slightly. This has more of a bluish tint overall to its plastics when compared to the Hi8 models. Being a Digital 8 Handycam camcorder, this was probably the top of the line model, and as such fetched a considerable deal of money when new. But despite that qualification and characteristic, this camcorder has a small LCD screen that was included on the lower end TRV 108 and 308 model Handycams, and not the larger, what I believe to be a 3-inch display that was included on the TRV 608 Hi8 Handycam. But of course, these being produced in the early 2000s, I'm sure having a screen of that size would add considerably to an already overinflated price, being a Digital 8 Handycam camcorder and not an analog Hi8 model. If we take a look at the front of the cameras, they both look almost exactly the same, be it not for the mention of this having hi-fi stereo capabilities and left and right indication of its stereo microphones. Curiously, there's a logo mentioning its infrared capabilities, whether that's there in relation to its night shot capabilities or the ability to use it with an external a wireless remote control from Sony. It remains to be seen. I believe it's the latter, as this model has night shot capabilities and it hasn't any similar logo on its front smoked black plastic piece. And also, of course, this being a Digital 8 model, it hasn't any ability to directly record the date and time directly on the video. It can be accomplished, as it always usually is with these Digital 8 and Mini DV camcorders. That is to say that the date and time are recorded on the tape, but it's not on the video. With this camcorder, I received not only this large capacity Sony Infolithium M SQ battery, which of course is genuine. It isn't one of those fakes that are circulating on eBay that look to be realistic until you examine them closely and then realize that they aren't the real deal. This is the real deal, thankfully, so no worries of short-lived lifespan or leaking battery acid or anything nasty and unfortunate such as that. This camcorder suffers from an interesting defect with its LCD display. If you'll forgive the fingerprints and smudges on the screen, you'll notice that we don't have any indication of what it's seeing through its lens. You may just be able to distinguish the black bars because this is set to 16:9 recording mode. When I first received this camcorder and powered it on, the display was fairly vivid and bright, but after a few moments it began to dim considerably to the point that it is now, where you can't even see anything. And this defect, if you will, repeats itself every single time you power this camcorder on after being left alone for a number of hours. So if I were to turn this camcorder off now and come back to it perhaps at the same time tomorrow, 24 hours later, its screen would start off nice and bright and vivid. It wouldn't give any indication as to this issue, but then as you continued to use the camcorder, it would continue to dim until there was nothing left on the screen. The person selling this mentioned that it had a C3122 or similar error code that was displayed every time power was applied to it. And of course, this being a for parts as is, no warranties expressed or implied sort of affair, I really didn't hold my hopes high that I would be able to restore this camcorder to working condition. Paddling this camcorder on the bottom, as suggested by numerous forums and online postings, the so-called Wackassony method, did nothing to alleviate the C31 something or other error code. I realized that this rubber roller, located right there in the center, was loose and resting down by the tape drum, which of course is not the location it should call home. In fact, its correct home is right between those two metal tape guides, and if you notice, it's actually beginning to come off. It isn't securely fastened to that metal post, and I had removed it from its resting position down by the tape drum, slid it over there, and if you notice, and I could get a good frame And if I could just manage to get it in frame, you'll notice just how loose it is. There's no friction holding it in place. I don't really know how these were held in place. I'm sure there was some sort of a pin, or, oops, that's not supposed to happen, but now you can get an accurate depiction of what it was I discovered when I bought this camcorder. So it's just a rubber roller. I don't really understand how how Sony managed to fasten this roller. I'm fairly certain they didn't solely rely upon friction to hold it in place, but maybe they did. With time, age, and abuse, it's just gotten very loose, and there's nothing really to stop it from falling off into the recesses of this camcorder, thus causing serious problems with the loading mechanism. It thinks that there's something wrong because it obviously cannot close. This rubber roller is preventing that from happening, and so then it flashes an error code on the display. Thankfully, somebody didn't decide to become impatient or belligerent and just decide to take their hand and smack the whole tape mechanism down, which I've seen a number of people do, and that seems to be an issue that was suffered by many of these camcorders, as evidenced by the physical damage that these tape baskets clearly show. People, I guess, just get frustrated with seeing that error code and realizing that this tape mechanism won't fully retract to its correct position. It'll stop halfway. As a result of irritation and frustration, they try forcing it down with their fist or their fingers, and that never ends well. You end up breaking more that way. But thankfully that wasn't the case with this camcorder, and as long as I'm able to place this rubber roller back on that metal pin, all seems to work well. I've reinstalled the rubber roller. Of course, there's again nothing holding it in place aside from friction alone, and that didn't seem to work too well in the past, so I do need to be careful about this, and if I tilt the camera completely on its side, I'm sure that roller would fall down. But from my limited testing I performed on this camcorder, just as long as you have a tape inserted, that issue doesn't seem to apply. The friction of the tape seems to be enough to hold that roller in place securely. With this camcorder, I received a new spiffy Case Logic case that came not only with 2 additional genuine Sony camcorder batteries, of course being limited capacity, this being the bargain basement lowest capacity FM30 battery that shipped with the camcorder when new, and then somebody probably became frustrated with the limited capacity it had, upgraded to an NP-FM50, and then perhaps they grew frustrated with that battery's capacity too, and then upgraded to this, again, a very high capacity battery. I also received with it yet another genuine Sony AC, I can't recall the model number, it'll come to me eventually, and I can't really be bothered. Oh well, I guess I will. Trying to keep this video brief and concise, but you should know my videos, they drag on much longer than they should. This is the AC-L10B, and being a genuine charger, you can never have too many of these, unlike the generic variants that really aren't that safe to use. Does anyone want to take a wild guess as to what purpose this serves? Well, I didn't at first either, until I realized this area down here. The previous owner, for whatever reason, wanted to record video unobtrusively without arousing suspicions, and the hole is perfectly placed for the lens, and then that cutout to serve as an opening for the microphone, so you don't just record muffled audio. Very interesting though, and I could see how this would be very useful in certain scenarios where video recording may be prohibited or frowned upon, but you otherwise disagree with those rules or what have you, with restrictions, and you'd like to record regardless, so you just go ahead and, if I could be bothered to zip this up, hold this casually by your side. With this camcorder I also received a lifetime supply of tapes, but knowing how often I record video and how much of it I do record, I'll be lucky to have this last me a year. This and the other tapes definitely contain some content worthy of a few lost tapes uploads, if not many. This one containing an hour-long recording of a musician performing covers of popular hit songs in a bar or restaurant sometime around 2004 or 5, maybe even 2006. Thankfully, they're all high 8 and digital 8 tapes. Again, they will be transferred into the computer, and the contents of which will be digested and archived if it happens to be interesting. If it's just personal video recordings or family recordings, then more likely than not they will be ending up in the trash can. the videos on my computer, that is, not the tapes. Something I neglected to mention, and I probably should have preceded all that mention and talk about the tapes, was that of this hand strap. Now, at first glance, it obviously does not look like a genuine Sony hand strap, and you'd certainly be right. Though this is a genuine Sony hand strap, it suffered from the typical deterioration of the vinyl covering, and then the adhesive or glue that held it onto the hand strap would peel off in your hand whenever you'd use the strap. They would act like breadcrumbs, helping you to remember where this camcorder happened to be in its past. Everywhere I'd put it, it would leave little strips of that Sony hand strap everywhere. Even though I removed all those peeling pieces off the hand strap, this adhesive was left behind, or whatever it may have been, and it would just leave this black substance all over your hands. This one isn't in as bad condition, but if I rub my hand on it, it starts to leave black smears all over it, and this is what would happen every time you ended up using the hand strap on this camcorder. I went ahead and took some isopropyl alcohol and just repeatedly wiped down the hand strap until all of that adhesive material was successfully removed, and now this soft plush-like material is the only thing remaining, which I can live with. I would like to replace this, especially considering that I have a genuine Sony hand strap that I took off of a parted out Sony TRV 87 height camcorder. And it's interesting how these hand straps on a number of the earlier model camcorders from Sony don't suffer from that deterioration and degradation that the later model height and Digital 8 models did. Very interesting. They must have changed materials or the adhesive that they used, and that ended up breaking down quite a bit quicker than that which was used on these earlier hand straps found on earlier Handycams. If you were wondering why this Sony Handycam is without its LCD display, it was actually a result of experimenting with swapping screens from this TRV 608 onto this TRV 140, which was unsuccessful, unfortunately, and I think that's directly attributable to the difference in screen sizes. When I finished connecting everything up properly, ensuring everything had a good secure connection, the screen flashed on for a brief moment, and then just a thin white line in the centermost position of the screen, and there was absolutely no way whatsoever that I was going to be able to get an actual usable display out of, well, this display. So you can see just faintly that it's gone into demo mode, but it's just very dim. In fact, it seems its screen is performing not unlike the Sony Ruvi camcorder that V Westlife had reviewed, which hadn't any backlight, so you'd have to tilt it into direct light just to be able to see it. And even with an appreciable amount of light, you still struggle to see the screen. So now I have compassion for those people which struggle with seeing the LCD display. So I have some sympathy for those who used a Sony Ruvi camcorder and struggled to see what they were recording through its built-in LCD display. Here we come now to the workshop, which, given the temperature outside, is thankfully air conditioned. Regrettably, you are going to need to endure the sound of air conditioning noise in the background, which I hope you'll forgive, but there's no way I'm going to be sweltering out here as I'm working on this. I've gone ahead and looked online, and it just so happened that there was a similarly sized screen from a Sony CCD TRV 108 or even a 308 height Handycam. Which model it came from is of very little importance, just as long as it wasn't from the TRV 608. And if we take a look here, we'll see that it's actually a TRV 308 display. Now you can see that it does vary slightly. Let's go ahead and dig into this camcorder. It shouldn't be too terribly difficult. In fact, the only major obstacle I'll have to overcome is that of 3 minutes of tape remaining, which I don't think I'll be able to manage. Now I won't go ahead and bore you with taking this unit apart. It's a fairly simple and straightforward process of simply removing these two screws and these two screws, and then there are two claws that are holding both pieces in place. Also, it's very useful to have properly sized screwdrivers for the task at hand, and this is no exception. I was attempting to use this one right here, but ended up not making a very good, ended up not gripping the screw properly, and proceeded to just about nearly strip the bottom screw, which isn't a major concern of mine, at least with this screen, as I'm going to be using the screws from this one just as soon as I clean whatever detritus has accumulated on them. Seems to be that these screws are magnets for corrosion and other foreign contaminants to reside upon. Food, I don't even know what that is, if that's rust, corrosion, or just food and crumbs. Who even knows? One thing that is causing me some concern is what appears to be corrosion. I sure hope the rest of the LCD is not affected by that. Looks to be some rust and other sediment and corrosion that's accumulated on that hinge. Same on this portion too. One thing I'd like to take note of, being that I'm using a display from a Hi8 model, the color of this LCD, which indicates your battery life remaining and some other useful information, actually has a yellowish tint to it. Now ordinarily, once you remove the screws, you need to squeeze these two portions of the display to easily remove it. There's a piece of black, what looks to be gaffer's tape, that is covering these connectors and securing them down. Since I've already been in here, I removed it and never replaced it, since I knew I was going to be replacing this display with one which was entirely brand new, or at least working. So it was of little importance to me to replace that. Well, as a result of having just so many Hi8 and Digital 8 tapes, it gets very easy to confuse one for the other and accidentally record over one which wasn't supposed to be. It's exactly the case here. I ended up switching tapes and recorded roughly another 20 to 25 minutes of my disassembling the camcorder's LCD panel and swapping it with the one I showed from the TRV-308. And this is what I discovered. Once I removed the exterior bezel that was obscuring access to the circuit board contained within, I noticed considerable amounts of corrosion and rust found pretty much everywhere on the board. You can observe very clearly obvious signs of corrosion, oxidation, and rust on various portions of the circuit board. And even these integrated circuit are very heavily oxidized and corroded. Almost looks like battery acid spilled out into here. I don't really know what this is, but I have a sneaking suspicion that it was exposed, perhaps even submerged in salt water.